With the printer starting to take shape, considering the Y and Z axis are pretty much near completion, it's time to move on with the final axis and the extruder itself. So on we go with the X axis assembly. So we'll start with the bag labelled X axis and extruder. In particular, we want the orange 3D printed carriage front section as shown here, along with the hardware in the bag labelled X axis. Ensuring you have the correct part to hand, proceed to insert 4 M3 square nuts into the top side where you'll find the 4 respective recesses. These need to go all the way in, so use an Allen key to push down on each nut, ensuring it's in as far as possible. The 2 middle nuts sit flush and line up with these holes, and the 2 side nuts go in slightly further to line up with here. Flip the part over and repeat the same process on the opposite side with another 4 M3 square nuts, again taking care to push all the way in. And finally, a single M3 nut in the recess in the centre. Okay, so moving on, we have 2 metal rods remaining at this stage, so with them to hand, carefully slide both smooth rods all the way into the carriage section we've just prepared. Check the rods are fully inserted by looking through the small inspection holes. And once in place, secure by inserting and tightening 4 M3x12 screws. We're working with plastic parts here, so no need to crank down super tight since you'll end up damaging the part. A nice snug fit is all that's required. With that done, set the assembly aside for a moment while we reach for the 2 remaining bearings in the rods and extrusions box. We need to follow the same procedure as before with greasing these bearings too, so give them a wipe to remove any machine oil, and proceed to insert the grease applicator, rotate until you feel a little friction, and squeeze to lubricate the 4 rows of balls within the linear bearing. Repeat the same process on the second bearing too. So with both bearings lubricated and any excess wiped away, hold one bearing in front of you so that the bottom 2 rows of balls are visible, and use a permanent marker to make a small mark on top of the outer surface of the bearing between both rows of balls. After which we repeat the same procedure on the second bearing. We will use these markings in the upcoming steps to achieve the desired bearing orientation. With bearings prepared, before we use them, we'll prepare the X-axis end section, another 3D printed orange part here, and on one side you'll notice the 2 circular holes for rods to be inserted, although before doing that, proceed to insert 2 M3 square nuts into the recesses, making sure to push them right down into their slots of course. And a single M3 lock nut into the 1 remaining recess in the side. If this is too difficult to push into place, insert a single M3x20 screw into the opposite end and tighten to pull the nut into place, taking care not to tighten too much, and remembering to remove the screw once the nut is in place. And with the screw removed, the nut should sit flush with the top. After which we can proceed to drop in a metal pulley into the recess in the side, taking care to line up the holes, before inserting the M3x20 screw again and tightening to secure the pulley into place. You don't want to over tighten here, just enough so that the pulley can still freely rotate when moved with your finger. Staying on this side for the moment, insert 2 M3x12 screws into the X end. Note that these are not being screwed into any nuts, they're biting directly into the plastic, so they may be a little tough to screw down into place. Also ensure you leave the screw head protruding above the surface of the plastic for now. With that done, give the 2 larger holes a quick check to ensure they are clean and free from any debris. Back to our installed rods now, where we carefully insert 1 prepared bearing onto each rod, after which we can wipe away any excess grease from the rod end, and then push the smaller X end we just prepared with the pulley onto the ends of the rods. Take care with orientation here. The screws on the larger carriage end must face upwards, as well as the 2 currently free screw holes on the smaller end. Push until the rods are inserted all the way into the carriage end. There are inspection holes on the top and bottom. Check these to ensure the rods are all the way in before inserting 2 M3x12 screws to secure. Insert these loosely for the moment as they will be completely tightened a little later. For now, we'll start assembling the X carriage itself using this black 3D printed part. prepare it by inserting a single M3 nut into the side. If it's proving too difficult to push in, insert an M3 screw from the opposite end to pull the nut back into its recess, remembering to remove the screw afterwards, of course. After which we insert a single M3 square nut into the recess on the bottom side just here, again making sure to push all the way in. With that prepared, we need to now install onto the main carriage assembly, in particular onto the two bearings. Place the carriage onto its end in this orientation so the screw heads are facing towards you, and align both bearings so that the marks we made earlier face back also. Now take the carriage and place it above the bearings, orientated so that the bearing pockets are facing you and the longer side of the part is on the left side. With the bearing pockets aligned, push the carriage down onto the bearings so that they slide into place. Once complete, each bearing should perfectly line up with the edges of the carriage. Onto our third and final axis motor next, clearly labelled X-axis. With the motor to hand, proceed to manually rotate the shaft so that the flat edge is facing towards you. Before dropping on a motor pulley, notice the orientation here. The teeth end should be facing towards the outer end of the shaft. Leave a 1mm gap between the base of the shaft and the pulley before tightening the first grub screw so that it tightens against the flat side of the motor shaft before rotating and tightening the second grub screw until secure. Double check orientation again so the teeth end facing outwards, as well as that 1mm gap between the pulley and the base of the shaft. Time to get this installed onto the main X-axis assembly now. The motor will sit on the flat, larger end of the assembly, so place the motor down in a diagonal orientation as shown, making sure the motor cable exits from the lower left side, and then lower the carriage down on top. Notice how the rods are on the right side here, before inserting two M3x12 screws from the top, securing the motor into position. Almost there with our X-axis now. All that's left is to insert and install the belt, so we'll do that next. With belt in hand, feed one end through the top of the metal pulley on the opposite end to the motor, and across to the central carriage with bearings. Before inserting the belt along the entire length of the upper groove into the X carriage, use a thin Allen key to push the belt down into place. Now take the other end of the belt and guide it around the bottom of the pulley, through the hole in the X carriage, guide it around the motor pulley from the bottom to top, before inserting the end into the lower groove in the X carriage, again using an Allen key to push the belt right down into the groove. Don't be too concerned if the belt feels a little loose at this stage, we'll be setting the correct tension a little later. And with that, the X carriage assembly is now complete. Double check orientation of all parts. Your assembly should look exactly as shown here. Okay, so now we need to attach the X carriage to the main body of the printer. To do this, we'll be using the Extruder package, so have that to hand. We'll start with the Z carriage, this orange 3D printed piece shown here. Proceed to install two M3 nuts into their respective locations in the side with the curve. Again, these need to be fully inserted, so if they are proving difficult to push in, use a screw from the opposite side to pull each into place. After which we can insert a single M3 square nut into the recess on the bottom flat side, fully pushed down into place. With that done, we're finally ready to mount the X carriage onto the printer itself. To do this, turn the printer assembly so that the rear side is facing you, before placing the X carriage assembly on the two bearings that have been held up with the central nut. Physically keep this in place for the moment, and place the Z carriage we just prepared onto the opposite side in this orientation, so that the round recess is towards the top side. In essence, we capture the bearings in between both sides. While holding both sides in place, insert two M3x30 screws in a diagonal fashion and proceed to tighten until snug. You can now release your hand and the assembly should stay in place. Insert and tighten two M3x30 screws into the remaining two holes, again just until snug. Now looking from below the carriage we just installed, rotate the nut so that the holes line up with the carriage, and then insert and tighten two M3x20 screws. It's important that these screws are not over tightened, as otherwise it can cause issues while printing. We'll route the X-axis motor cable down to the electronics board next, so proceed to install the included textile sleeve and wrap it around the motor cable. Move the sleeve so it's up against the motor end, and secure the sleeve with a zip tie a few millimeters from the end. Do not over tighten the zip tie here as you could damage the cable, just enough so it holds the sleeve securely before trimming the remaining tail off the zip tie as close to the head as possible. Now guide the cable into the lower part of the extrusion, just beneath the previous extrusion cover. Note that the textile section of the cable stays outside. It's the bare cable end that goes into the extrusion, after which the extrusion can be covered with the plastic cover. Don't be tempted to place the entire length into the extrusion. The X-carriage will be moving up and down the Z-axis, so this covered part of the cable needs enough slack so that the carriage can reach from the very top to the very bottom. Nevertheless, the X-motor cable can now be connected to the electronics board, second port along on the top left. So at this point, going from left to right, we have the Z-axis motor, X-axis motor, and then the Y-axis motor, all connected and ready. And we're looking like we have an actual 3D printer now, all coming along nicely. So while we're here, we'll go ahead and set the tension on the X-carriage. Begin by moving the X-carriage itself across all the way to the Z-carriage. Now using a finger, push the belt down in the center of the X-axis. Some force should be needed for bending the belt, but don't try to overstretch the belt as you might damage the printer. You can adjust the tension by using the two screws we partially inserted on the end of the X-axis. Releasing the screws will decrease the overall tension, tightening the screws will increase tension. Finally, inspect the X-axis from the side. Align the X-end parallel to the Z-axis smooth rods by twisting the plastic part. Do not use too much force to twist as you could damage the X-axis. After which we can secure the X-end by tightening both screws on the front side of the plastic part. After tightening, check once more to ensure the X-end is parallel with the Z-axis. With that done, we can move on to preparing and installing the extruder assembly. So we'll start with the extruder motor, the final motor in the package, clearly labelled extruder. Just as before, there is a flat side to the shaft which you can turn to face towards you, before placing the extruder pinion over the shaft in this orientation, so the teeth end up facing away from the motor, while leaving a 1.5mm gap between the motor and the pinion. You can use the 1.5mm Allen key to set the gap, before tightening the set screw against the flat side of the shaft. Okay, so we're ready for the extruder front section now, this 3D printed part shown here. Starting with the predominantly flat side here, insert 3 M3 nuts into each of the 3 respective recesses, ensuring they get pushed right down into place. Feel free to use an M3 screw from the opposite end to pull the nut down into place if need be. I actually prefer this method as it means the nuts get pulled in all the way into their recesses nice and straight, so they're guaranteed to be straight and ready for use later. Once done, flip the part over and insert a single bearing into the opposite side. Again, a tight fit, but once in should sit flush with the plastic. With the front side done, we can now prepare the back side too, another 3D printed part with a brass fitting already pre-installed in the top corner. Starting with the open side, insert a single M3 nut into place, again push right down, or use a screw from the opposite side to pull it back into place, whichever is easier. After which we flip the part over and insert an M3 nylon lock nut into place and either pushing down or pulling into place from the opposite end. And then insert a single bearing into the provided space. You may find it easier to place the bearing on a flat surface and press the part down onto it from above. Make sure the bearing is aligned with the top surface of the part and doesn't protrude over and above. With the extruder front and rear sections now prepared, we'll move on to preparing the extruder idler next, this small piece shown here. Start by inserting an M3 square nut into the side of the small end, making sure to push right down into place, enough so that the hole aligns with the printed part, before placing a bearing inside the rounded slot, far enough so that the central hole aligns with the idler. Making way for a bearing pin to be inserted, again press down if it's easier, although this needs to be inserted enough so that the pin aligns with the top surface of the printed idler, and the bearing turns freely. Okay, so time to get these prepared pieces installed onto the extruder motor. Position the motor in this orientation, so diagonally and with the motor wire coming from the left lower side, and then place the extruder front section on top of the motor in this orientation, so flat side down and with the bearing showing at the top. Secure with 2 M3x12 screws. Next, we want to reach for the filament spur and gently lower this into the bearing. The longer end with the jagged groove must face upwards in this orientation. Once in place, make sure both gears have meshed together nicely by gently turning one and making sure it turns the other relatively smoothly. With that done, time to lower the extruder rear section down into position. Note the orientation here. The filament spur we just inserted needs to go into the bearing as you lower the piece down. Once sure that the orientation is correct, secure the parts together using 3 M3x25 screws. These will catch with the metal nuts previously installed onto the extruder front section, although tighten cautiously so as to not break either of the plastic parts. Once done, your construction should look exactly as shown here. Flip the unit over as it's time to insert the idler now. This sits in the gap between the front and rear parts already installed, with the rounded end going in first. Align the holes on both parts and secure it with a single M3x25 screw. Do not over tighten though, just enough to hold everything in place and so that the idler can freely move. Next, with an M3x40 screw in hand, place the included spring over the screw, and while holding the extruder assembly with the idler assembly pressed inwards with one hand, proceed to insert and tighten the screw with the spring into the extruder. This goes through the extruder and secures into the end of the idler. Stop tightening when the screw head is aligned with the edge of the plastic part. Time to insert a PTFE tube now, so with the tube in hand, line up alongside a ruler and use a marker to place a mark at the 2.5cm point, after which we locate the hole for the PTFE tube on the side of the extruder assembly and insert the marked end of the tube all the way into the extruder until you reach the marking just made. This can be a little slippery, but persevere, before securing the tube with a single M3x12 screw going in from above. We're all done with this part of the extruder now, so it's time to mount it to the Z carriage. So with it in position, before going any further, ensure the orientation is correct. The PTFE tube should be facing to the left, and the brass fitting is to the top right, before securing with an M3x25 screw in the lower hole. Finally, grab the small 3D printed inspection door and place it in the top of the extruder, carefully aligning the holes, after which we insert a single M3x25 screw. Again, do not over tighten, just enough so that everything is secure, but so that the inspection door can move freely. Leaving the extruder motor cable hanging for now, we'll tidy this up later. And we're done. That's the X-axis assembly as well as the extruder complete and installed. Give all screws a quick check over and we can now move on with the next section where we'll construct the print head onto the X-axis carriage as well as the heat bed down on the Y-axis.